twin moons drifted over the refugee quarter of Cathar Prime, casting molten orange light across, a maze of shattered pre-siege ruins and hurriedly assembled aid shelters. Wind carried thin veils of grit through the alleys, where beings from countless star nations crowded together in fragile, uncomfortable coexistence. Their voices blended into a restless chorus beneath the rhythmic hum of malfunctioning climate generators. Moving quietly among them was a solitary human man. His face, lined and hardened by years of catastrophe, told stories he rarely shared. His hands, scarred, calloused, and built for labor, had once raised homes on distant frontier outposts, only to watch those same homes reduced to ash. Now he carried little more than a battered pack and a lifetime of grief, each memory a weight that strangers passing by would never see. Most residents barely acknowledged the lone human crossing their threshold, and even fewer noticed the faint, fragile sounds that would alter the course of his future. What he was about to uncover in those desolate shadows would not only reshape his fractured world but stir tensions that stretched across the entire Maravan cluster. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the stories we bring to life. And drop a comment below. Tell us which corner of the galaxy or the real world you're watching from. We always read every message. His name was Rylan Voss, and once he had been a father. Inside the inner pocket of his travel coat, protected by a transparent stasis sleeve, he kept a small photo, edges folded, colors fading, of a child with star-bright eyes and a grin so unmistakably her mother's. They had lived on Arden Ridge, a terraforming settlement where human families carved their hopes into the soil of a newborn world. But that was before the ignition storms, before the evacuation alarms, before the shuttle meant to save his family erupted in a fireball above the launch rail. While he watched from a ravine below, helpless, unbelieving, Cathar Prime accepted the flood of displaced souls, but acceptance and welcome were worlds apart. The native ruling body, the Cathari Assembly, tolerated humans but rarely trusted them. In their eyes, humanity pushed too far, too fast, trespassing into territories they barely understood. The refugee quarter sprawled over what had once been a massive fabrication yard. Rows of prefab shelters stood shoulder to shoulder, their polymer exteriors streaked with the planet's copper-tinted rainfall. Rylan's assigned pod resembled hundreds of others, barely 12 square meters, containing a sleep mat, a reclaimer sink, and a nutrient printer that produced food only a starving person would call food. He walked the main corridor as the binary dusk settled, the twin moons dropping at opposite angles and painting the sky with unnatural, overlapping shadows. Cathari citizens, with their iridescent scales and slit pupils, passed him without acknowledgement, their gazes sliding over him with habitual disdain. To reach his shelter, Rylan crossed through a partly demolished section of the quarter, an area left broken since the orbital siege decades earlier. Steel beams twisted upward like skeletal fingers. Fallen walls created black pockets of shadow, where the glow strips couldn't reach. He was halfway through this scarred zone when he heard it. A faint sound. High, sharp, almost a cry. His heart, an organ he believed long numb, jerked painfully in his chest. He stopped, turning toward a collapsed supply depot where an overhanging slab of ferrocrete created a cave-like hollow. Darkness pooled beneath it, thick and quiet. "Hey," he called gently. The sound ceased. Then came a softer noise, fragile, trembling. Rylan moved carefully, drawing a palm-sized lantern from his pack. The beam sliced through the murk, revealing broken crates, coils of abandoned wiring, and shredded insulation tangled like vines. Then he saw them. Two tiny reflections, glowing, green, unblinking. He knelt immediately. The light washed over them. Two small beings no larger than his forearm. Their fur was silvery white, catching iridescent hues with every slight movement. Their faces were unmistakably cat-like, short muzzles, delicate whiskers, ears flattened tight against their skulls. Yet their torsos were eerily humanoid, with small shoulders and slender arms tipped with retractable claws. Hybrid younglings. The truth struck him like a blow. Feline humanoid hybrids had been the center of violent political debates throughout the Maravan cluster. Engineered during the war through forbidden gene splicing, most had been abandoned after the treaties outlawed such experiments. Many believed none had survived. And yet here they were, Two terrified cubs lost in a ruin no one cared to check. Only a handful of hybrid lineages had escaped extermination after the ban, living in hidden pockets of space where the law looked the other way. These two, judging by their size, could not have been older than a few lunar cycles. Their fur, once luminous, was clumped with dust and dirt. Both trembled so hard their tiny frames shook, clinging to each other as though the world outside might swallow them whole. One of them, a little female, had bright silver rings circling her eyes and trailing toward the tips of her ears. The other, slightly bigger with muted markings, appeared to be male. Rylan lowered his voice to a whisper. "Hey, it's all right. I'm not here to hurt you." The cubs didn't move. They just stared, their brilliant emerald eyes reflecting, his lantern like shards of distant stars. The little female let out a noise, something caught between a distressed chirp and a trembling purr. Rylan slowly extended an open hand, palm up, fingers relaxed. The male cub pushed himself forward, emitting a soft defensive snarl as he placed himself between the female and the stranger towering over them. "I know you're frightened," Rylan murmured. "Half the time I'm just as afraid as you are. But I can help you. I can keep you safe." The female blinked, tilting her head slightly, regarding him with a level of awareness that felt unsettling for a creature so young. After a long, trembling moment, she lifted one delicate paw and brushed it against the tip of his finger. The touch hit Rylan like an emotional shockwave. Not magic, not anything supernatural, just the piercing, overwhelming feeling of being needed. Again, something he thought had been buried with his past. He slid out of his coat and laid it gently on the cracked floor. Moving with the care of someone handling crystalline glass, he gathered both cubs into his arms and wrapped the coat around them. They weighed almost nothing. Their tiny heartbeats fluttered against his palms like panicked wings. "I've got you," he whispered. "You're safe now." But he barely had time to straighten before a sharp voice cut through the gloom. "Step away from those organisms." Rylan spun toward the sound. 3 Cathari enforcement wardens stood near the mouth of the ruined passage, their scale-lined uniforms catching the last hints of fading dusk. The leader, a tall female whose rank badge glowed faintly, rested her hand on the neural baton clipped to her belt. "Those hybrids are unregistered," she announced. "They're slated for retrieval and disposal. You are violating assembly protocols." Rylan tightened his grasp instinctively. The female cub whimpered, burying her face deeper into the fabric of his coat. "Disposal?" he repeated, anger sharpening his voice. "That's the word you use. They are genetically unstable. Remnants from an outlawed creation. Program," the officer replied coolly. "The district cannot risk contamination." "They're children," Rylan said, low but unwavering. Terrified, alone, and still children. The officer's pupils narrowed to thin black lines. "You've been on Cathar Prime for 3 standard months, human. You do not comprehend our statutes. Surrender them." The cubs shrank tighter against Rylan. The male released the faintest growl, not loud, not strong, but fierce in its own desperate way. "No," Rylan said, quiet, final. The officer's hand shifted fully onto her baton. "This is not a debate." For the first time in years, something inside Rylan rose up, something he believed had died the day he lost his family. The spark of a man who once fought for the people he loved. The 3 wardens spread into a half circle, moving with the confidence of officials who rarely met resistance. The leader's identification tag glowed, with her name, Commander Saloon. "I'll give you one last warning," she said, stepping closer. "Place the hybrids on the ground and step away." Rylan's mind raced. They were armed. He wasn't. They had authority. He had none. Every rational thought screamed at him to hand the cubs over. But the little female pressed her tiny head against his chest, purring in fragile desperation, clinging to the only warmth she had left. "How did they even end up out here?" Rylan asked quietly. "Cubs this young don't wander off. What happened to their parents?" Saloon's jaw tightened. "That isn't your concern." But one of the younger wardens, scales still bright from youth, shifted uneasily. "Commander, their mother was discovered dead 2 rotations ago. Starvation and exposure. We've been searching for the little one since." "Ravel," Saloon snapped. "So they're orphans," Rylan murmured. "And your solution is to eliminate them because they're an inconvenience." "The Assembly has strict regulations regarding hybrid strains," Saloon said sharply. "These creatures are artificial constructs, products, of war crimes and unregulated gene splicing. Their existence violates half a dozen interstellar accords. They exist anyway, Rylan replied. They breathe. They're terrified. They feel pain. That alone should matter. The light from Kethar's twin moons intensified, washing the ruins in cold, pale radiance. The young male cub peeked out from Rylan's coat, fixing his glowing eyes on Selûne with surprising defiance. He gave another tiny hiss, more symbolic than threatening, but full of courage for someone so impossibly small. The little male gave a tiny snarl, more of a squeak than a threat, but there was nothing funny about it. That fragile sound carried every ounce of bravery he had left. Selûne lifted her disruptor. "This is your final warning," she said, her voice cold as fractured stone. The weapon's core ignited with a harsh blue glow, humming like a captured storm. "If you want them," Rylan replied softly, "you'll have to get past me." He wasn't yelling. He wasn't posturing. It was simply the truth settling inside him like a long-buried instinct resurfacing. 3 months earlier, he had arrived on Cathar Prime hollowed out, surviving the refugee intake with a blank stare and hands that shook when no one was looking. A man who existed out of habit, not hope. But these trembling, abandoned cubs, these tiny remnants of a forbidden species, had reached into the ashes of who he used to be and found a spark he didn't know was still there. Selûne blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. "You understand the penalty for obstructing planetary security protocols?" she asked, her narrow pupils shrinking. "You could be deported back into human space if any colony will even take you." "I understand," Rylan said. Ravel, the youngest officer, shifted uncomfortably, his iridescent plates flickering with uncertainty. "Commander, maybe we could file a report first," he ventured. "Submit this for review? If the human wants to request guardianship, there might be systems for that." "There are no systems for anomalies like these," Selûne snapped. But Ravel's hesitation cracked open a narrow gap, and Rylan stepped into it. "If your laws are so unambiguous," he said, "then the processing should be properly documented. Handled through official channels, observed, logged." He glanced around at the collapsed structures and darkened streets. So why carry out such a delicate operation here? In the ruins, after curfew, with no witnesses? Selûne's eyes narrowed to razor-thin slits. "Are you implying misconduct?" "I'm asking for daylight," Rylan said. "If this is standard procedure, let the council scrutinize it. Let me file a formal petition. If they deny it, I won't resist their decision." He gestured around him. "But this feels like something happening in the shadows for a reason." The third officer, Taryn, shifted slightly, opening a faint space in the security formation. It was a small movement, but unmistakably one of doubt, Selûne noticed. For a long stretch of silence, she stared at Rylan, the moons reflected off her metallic scales, making her expression unreadable and sharp. 48 hours, she said at last. "Submit your petition to the Migrant Oversight Bureau. All of it. Biological evaluations, resource declarations, custody justification. The council will deliberate. And until then?" Rylan asked. "Until then, the hybrids remain with you." Her voice hardened. "But if you hide them, falsify reports, or fail to appear, the consequences will make deportation look merciful. Do we understand each other?" Rylan nodded. Clearly. Selûne turned sharply, her officers falling into step. But Ravel looked back once, his expression strained with something, pity perhaps, or uncertainty about the orders he'd just followed. The moment their footsteps faded, Rylan's legs buckled. The adrenaline drained from him all at once, leaving his limbs unsteady. Both cubs felt the shift in his heartbeat and pressed closer, uttering soft, anxious trills. "It's all right," he murmured shakily. "We bought time. Now we have to figure out how to make it mean something." He looked down at them, two lives so small he could feel every heartbeat against his ribs. The female, whom he'd started calling Leary in his mind, had already fallen asleep, exhaustion weighing down her tiny body. The male, Bryn, remained alert, his emerald eyes tracking Rylan with unsettling focus for someone so young. "You're going to be trouble," Rylan whispered. Bryn opened his mouth in a miniature yawn, revealing a row of sharp little teeth, then nudged Rylan's hand with his forehead and released a low, vibrating purr. And for the first time since he had watched an evacuation shuttle carrying his family vanish in a fireball, Rylan felt tears gather, hot, unexpected, and dangerous. They were not tears of sorrow. They were the first flickers of hope. Ryland's housing module had never felt smaller than when he carried the cubs inside. The cramped space was suddenly alive with movement as the little creatures explored their new environment. Exhausted as they were, they still moved with an instinctual elegance, predators in miniature. Lyri approached everything with delicate curiosity, tapping objects with her paws, whiskers fluttering as she assessed each new surface. Bryn stayed closer to Ryland, always positioning himself slightly ahead, always watching the shadows like a tiny sentinel. He prioritized food. After several attempts, he finally coaxed the ration synthesizer to produce something resembling the high-protein mix carnivores required. The result was a lumpy, grayish paste with a metallic odor, but the cubs devoured it with frantic hunger that made his throat tighten. While they ate, Ryland sat at his small workstation. He activated the planetary administration terminal, and the interface bloomed across the screen. Dense, labyrinthine, and utterly unsympathetic. Navigating the bureaucratic channels of the Kethari authority was like trying to climb a cliff with numb fingers. Finding the correct petition form was only the beginning, and he had 48 hours. Navigating the administrative network was like wandering through a digital maze designed to defeat hope. Ryland clicked through one submenu after another, 17 in total, until he finally reached the correct path. Application for cross-species. Guardianship non-native life forms. The form unfolded like a procedural hydra. Species identification, age approximation, medical history, behavioral stability charts, resource allotment plans, long-term development projections. Every category fractured into multiple layers, each demanding documentation he didn't possess. Lyri finished licking the last smear of nutrient paste from her bowl and clambered into Ryland's lap with innocent confidence. She tucked herself into a tight curl, pressing her face against his stomach. The soft vibration of her purr warmed through his entire torso. Bryn lay beside them, head resting on Ryland's thigh, his green eyes slowly sinking shut as sleep claimed him. Ryland kept working. Under the section Custodial Justification, something inside him opened. He typed everything: his technical background, his history as a father, his understanding of growth patterns and emotional needs, his willingness to surrender every spare resource he had to ensure the cubs' survival. By the time dawn arrived, the smaller of Kethar Prime's twin suns spilled violet light through the window. Both cubs twitched in their sleep, dreaming of things he hoped he'd never have to understand. He submitted the petition exactly as the larger sun broke the horizon. The screen chimed. Submission received. Status under administrative review. Estimated decision 36-48 hours. The Migrant Administration Center stood near the district hub, an ugly slab of concrete and alloy, plates meant to look functional but succeeded only in looking exhausted. Ryland arrived as the doors unlocked for the day. The cubs were tucked securely in a carrier he had fashioned from his old expedition pack. Their bright eyes peeked through the mesh as if cataloging every stranger. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and recycled oxygen, the scent every refugee learned to recognize. Rows of rigid seats faced a wall of service counters. The morning rush was already underway. Humans, reptilians, crystalline beings, avians, all clutching forms or scanning terminals with weary determination. Ryland entered his petition number into the kiosk. Queue position 47. Estimated wait 3 hours. 2 hours later, raised voices surged near the entrance. Ryland glanced up just as a news crew stepped inside. Independent reporters from the Interworld Conquered broadcast. Their lead correspondent, a tall, blue-scaled Sonari woman, moved through the room with practiced precision. Her gaze snagged on Ryland instantly, or rather on the carrier at his feet. She approached, camera operator in tow. "Excuse me," she said, offering a polite nod. "I'm Nira Velis with the ICB. May I ask what brings you to the Bureau today?" Ryland answered cautiously. "I'm filing for guardianship." Her eyes dipped toward the mesh window. "For them?" she asked quietly. "Those are hybrid younglings." "Orphans," Ryland said. "I'm trying to obtain legal custody." Nira blinked, genuinely taken aback. "They're remarkable. How did they end up with you?" Ryland told her everything, finding them in the ruins, the confrontation with security, the 48-hour ultimatum. A ring of refugees formed around them, listening. A crystalline Threx woman stepped closer, her faceted features casting refracted light across the room, empathy glittering in her expression. Nira spoke softly. The Council's stance on hybrid species is uncompromising. You know, guardianship approvals for off-species applicants are exceedingly rare. I know, Rylan said. But they're alive. They're children, and they deserve someone who won't treat them like biohazard scrap. He glanced at the cubs. If the Council rejects the petition, at least I'll know I didn't walk away. And if they deny it? She asked gently. Rylan drew a slow breath. Then I'll deal with what comes next. But I will not let them be processed like broken equipment. Nira straightened, her expression thoughtful. This interview will be broadcast tonight. People across the sectors need to hear what's happening in these districts. Before Rylan could respond, a voice called from the service windows. Number 47, Rylan Voss. The administrator waiting for him was an older Sonari male. His scales dulled by age, he studied the petition displayed on his screen, brow ridges lifting slightly. This is unusual, he said. Hybrid custody petitions require council authorization. That process normally spans several weeks, often months. I don't have months, Rylan replied. Security Chief Saloon gave me a 48-hour window. The administrator's jaw tightened, barely noticeable but unmistakable. Saloon operates under her own interpretation of the guidelines, he said carefully, not always in alignment with proper procedure. He tapped through a few pages of the application. Your filing is surprisingly thorough, more detailed than what I received from professional advocates. He entered a command into the system. I'm marking your petition for accelerated review. The council convenes tomorrow. If I can attach your case to their schedule, you may receive a ruling within your deadline. Rylan exhaled. Thank you. The administrator shook his head faintly. Don't thank me yet. The council's history with hybrid cases is far from promising, but your argument is compelling. He looked at the carrier, at the two small lives sleeping inside. And perhaps, he added quietly, compelling is exactly what they need. The administrator printed a thin data slip and handed it across the counter. Council review scheduled for tomorrow at 0900 hours. Central Chambers. Be prepared to argue your case in person, he said, and understand. If their ruling goes against you, there will be no appeals. Outside, the morning crowd had thickened. Nira Velis and her broadcast team stood waiting near the steps, their equipment already recording. Tomorrow, 900 hours, she repeated as Rylan approached. We'll be there to cover every moment of the council hearing. Whatever the outcome, your story matters. People need to see what's on the line. That evening, Rylan fed the cubs again. With their stomachs full, Leary and Bryn roamed the cramped unit with growing boldness, pouncing on discarded packing foam, tumbling over each other in clumsy bursts of energy, their tiny claws clicking softly on the polymer floor. When night settled over the district, Rylan lay on the sleeping pad with the two small beings curled tightly against him. Leary purred softly in her dreams, a gentle vibration against his ribs. Bryn's breathing grew deep and even, his ear flicking occasionally at phantom noises only he could hear. Rylan stared up at the dim ceiling, unable to sleep. Tomorrow could change everything, or end everything. One thought pulsed through his mind, quiet but relentless. What if caring isn't enough? The council tower was the tallest structure in the district, a spiraling pillar of refractive crystal that scattered daylight into drifting shards of color across its surface. Inside, the atrium stretched upward like a cathedral, its walls lined with radiant murals depicting the Sonari people's long history. Rylan arrived early, the cubs tucked securely into their upgraded carrier. Leary's ears twitched as she absorbed the shimmering architecture. Bryn, ever vigilant, watched every movement around them, tail tip flicking nervously. Reporters crowded the entrance, multiple networks now. Not just Nira's. Word of the case had spread through the migrant districts and beyond. A small advocacy circle had formed near the lobby steps. Interworld activists, humans, and several non-human refugees holding modest signs. Among them, the Threx woman from the administrative office approached Rylan, her crystalline skin catching the light like fractured starlight. We came to support you, she said quietly. Whatever happens inside that chamber, remember that others see what you're fighting for, and that it matters. Rylan swallowed the sudden tightness in his throat. At exactly 900 hours, a deep harmonic chime resonated through the atrium. The massive crystalline doors parted, revealing the council chamber beyond. The chamber had been designed for one purpose, to intimidate. Circular seating tiers rose like steps toward the heavens. At the far end stood 7 elevated thrones, each occupied by a robed council member. Petitioner Voss, a functionary, called, his amplified voice echoing through the hall. Please step onto the presentation platform. Rylan walked forward, his footsteps hollow against the polished floor. He set the carrier beside him so the cubs remained, visible to the council and the crowd, gathering behind him. The central counselor, a tall female whose silver-toned scales shimmered under the chamber. Lighting activated her console. I am Counselor Valen, she announced. This session addresses petition, signed 124H request, for guardianship over 2 hybrid younglings, filed by Rylan Voss, petitioner. You have 15 minutes to present your statement. Leary made a tiny chirp from inside the carrier, just a quiet sound of reassurance, a reminder that she knew he was near. Rylan drew a steady breath. Counselors, he began. 3 days ago, I found these younglings in the shattered remains of Sector 9, alone, starving. Their mother had died from exposure and hunger. Without intervention, they would have been dead by nightfall. He paused, letting the truth settle in the air. I understand the Council's stance on hybrid species. They are tied to a tragic era in Sonari history. They were engineered through processes that violated every boundary of ethics and dignity. He rested a hand gently on the carrier. But these 2, Leary and Bryn, they never chose that past. They aren't responsible for the mistakes or crimes that created them. They're simply children trying to exist in a system that sees them as a problem instead of as lives. Counselor Valen interrupted, her voice steady and cold. We are well informed on the emotional framing, petitioner. The matter before us is legal. Hybrids fall under the classification of engineered organisms. Existing statutes mandate their removal from public zones. Rylan met her gaze. Then I'm asking the Council to reconsider those statutes, or at least carve a narrow exception for abandoned juveniles who pose no danger to anyone. Another counselor leaned forward, his expression analytical. You have resided on Cathar Prime for less than a quarter cycle, he said. You have no civic standing beyond refugee status and minimal resources. What convinces you that you can provide proper care for beings with complex biological needs? Rylan let out a slow breath. I may not have influence. I may not have wealth. But I know what young beings require. I raised a child. I know they need stability, nourishment, patience, and someone who sees them as individuals instead of classifications. He placed a hand over his heart. And I'll learn whatever I must to support them. But above everything else, I care whether they live or die. Sentiment again, Phelan said sharply. Rylan didn't look away. Maybe sentiment is exactly what's been missing. Affection alone cannot stabilize organisms, whose genetic structure is unpredictable, one of the counselors declared, her voice echoing across the chamber. Rylan did not flinch. Unpredictable, he repeated softly. Every child is unpredictable. Every parent takes on risks they can't fully measure. But civilizations don't abandon their young because they might be complicated. That isn't wisdom. That's fear pretending to be order. A restless shift moved through the tiers of counselors. In the audience, low murmurs of agreement rippled outward like a quiet tide. High Chair Valen lifted a hand, restoring stillness. Your conviction is noted, petitioner. Yet our responsibility is not to sentiment. It is to the stability of the Cathari Dominion. Individual cases cannot overshadow societal safeguards. I'm not asking you to rewrite the Dominion's population strategy, Rylan said steadily. I'm asking you to allow 2 small hybrids to live under care, under supervision, with someone willing to raise them, guide them, and teach them where they belong. A counselor leaned forward, metallic plumage catching the light. And when they reach maturity, recorded reports indicate hybrid breeds suffer severe identity imbalance and psychological deterioration. You may be condemning them to lifelong instability. Or, Rylan countered gently, I may be offering them a future that your laws refuse to imagine. Their suffering doesn't come from their biology, it comes from how societies like ours treat them. We fear their origins instead of seeing who they are. He hesitated only a moment before stepping fully into vulnerability. 3 months ago, he said, voice roughening, my family died. My spouse and daughter. I watched the flames take them while I stood powerless. I came to Kethar Prime hollowed out, breathing but not living. And then I found these two, abandoned, starving, one breath away from being erased because they were inconvenient. He swallowed hard. I can't save the people I lost, but I can save these two. I can give them the one thing every conscious being deserves, a chance. If you deny this petition, you're not just condemning them. You're declaring that some lives don't matter, that compassion has limits, that biology is more important than personhood. Silence fell so complete it felt like the air had frozen. Inside the carrier, Leary released a soft churring sound, sensing the tension. Bryn pressed against the mesh, emerald eyes fixed on Rylan with pure trust. Trust he feared he might not be allowed to keep. High Chair Valen lowered her gaze to her console. This council requires situational testimony. Commander Saloon, present yourself. From a side passage, Commander Saloon strode forward, armor immaculate, her posture rigid. She positioned herself beside Rylan, though she made no effort to acknowledge him. Commander, Valen said, state your findings. Saloon delivered her report with the cold precision of an autopsy. She described the younglings as unlisted biomech hybrids, their mother as an unauthorized cross specimen who evaded detection, and Rylan as a traumatized refugee interfering with protocol. Her conclusion was equally stark. In my professional assessment, these hybrids should have been processed immediately. Allowing them to remain is a risk to Dominion security and an ethical erosion of established law. Thank you, Commander. Petitioner, your response. Rylan met Saloon's eyes, saw the rigid loyalty to procedure, and then faced the council again. Commander Saloon is doing what she was trained to do. She follows rules built by people who were afraid, but rules aren't flawless. Sometimes they preserve old wounds instead of addressing present truths. He touched the carrier gently. These two are not a demographic threat. They are children. Their existence exposes our failure, not theirs. A silent conversation passed between the council members. Tiny motions, shared glances, micro-expressions only those familiar with governance would catch. Finally, Valen spoke. The council will recess for closed deliberation. Petitioner Rylan Voss, you will receive our decision within 6 standard hours. A resonant chime marked the adjournment. Lights brightened. The chamber exhaled. Rylan stood unmoving, doubt churning through him like a storm. Had he spoken bravely or recklessly? Nira approached with her recording crew. Rylan, that was extraordinary. Also possibly the most diplomatically suicidal thing I've ever filmed. The audience filtered out. Refugees, citizens, advocates, many stopping to grip his arm. Murmur support, offer small words of courage. 6 hours. The number felt like a sentence. He sought refuge in a small park beside the crystalline tower. Releasing the cubs, he allowed them to explore under close watch. Leary flopped into a bed of soft luminescent moss, rolling joyfully until her fur shimmered with green dust. Bryn leapt atop a low stone barrier, surveying the area like a miniature guardian. Rylan watched them with a quiet ache. If the council ruled against him, he needed to remember every sound, every gesture, just in case. Hope was dangerous. But love had already taken root. 4 hours into the wait, his terminal chimed sharply. Return to council chambers immediately. Decision finalized. His hands trembled as he gathered the cubs. Everything, every breath, every future was about to hinge on the next few minutes. Rylan gathered the younglings into their carrier. The walk back to the crystalline tower felt impossibly strange, both too short and far too long. Inside the atrium, most visitors had already cleared out, leaving only Nira's crew and a small cluster of supporters waiting, like a quiet constellation of hope. He stepped into the chamber. The 7 counselors were already seated, their faces arranged into mask-like neutrality. High Chair, Valen activated her console and the room fell still. Petitioner Voss, she began. This council has reviewed your petition in full. The matters raised here surpass simple custodial concerns. They touch upon the core of our ethics, our definition of personhood, our obligations to vulnerable beings, and what it truly means to call ourselves a civilized society. Rylan's breath caught. His throat tightened until he could barely swallow. Inside the carrier, Leary gave a soft, questioning chirp, sensing the tension around her. The Dominion recognizes, Valen continued, that the regulations governing hybrid classifications were forged during a period of wartime panic and existential threat. Those directives served their purpose then. The question before us is whether they serve justice now. She looked directly at him, her silver-irised pupils narrowing thoughtfully. After extensive review, testimonial evaluation, and internal deliberation, this council has reached the following findings. The entire chamber held its breath. 1. Hybrid juveniles cannot be held responsible for the circumstances of their engineering. 2. Sentient beings, regardless of their biological origin, are entitled to legal protections under interspecies doctrine. 3. Denying guardianship, exclusively on the basis of genetic classification without considering unique circumstances, constitutes a failure of moral reasoning. A weight seemed to lift from the air, yet Rylan didn't dare move. Therefore, Valen announced, her voice carrying through the vaulted chamber, by a vote of 6-1, the council grants provisional guardianship of the juveniles, designated Leary and Bryn to petitioner Rylan Voss. This arrangement includes the following conditions. Relief crashed into him so forcefully his knees nearly buckled. Inside the carrier, both younglings stirred with soft, curious sounds as if they sensed the shift in emotion. First, Valen listed, the juveniles will undergo routine medical examinations. Second, petitioner Voss will complete mandatory training concerning hybrid physiology and behavioral care. Third, his residents must meet Dominion standards for nurturing developing beings. Fourth, this arrangement will be re-evaluated annually. Fifth, should any significant complications arise, the council retains authority to reassess custody. I accept every condition, Rylan said, voice cracking with raw gratitude. Thank you, all of you. One additional matter, another counselor added, a tall figure with forest green scales. This decision sets precedent. Accordingly, we are establishing a review committee to reevaluate the Dominion's current hybrid statutes. Petitioner Voss, given your involvement and personal insight, we request that you join the committee as an advisor. Rylan blinked, stunned. I'd be honored. Valen rose from her seat. This session is hereby concluded. Petitioner Voss, proceed to the administrative wing to finalize documentation. She paused, subtle but unmistakably humanizing. And I hope you and the younglings forge a good life together. The resonant dismissal chime echoed through the chamber. The counselors departed. Rylan stood motionless on the central platform, tears slipping freely down his face, while the small audience erupted into applause. Nira hurried toward him with her recorder drone gliding close behind. How do you feel? She asked breathlessly. Like I can breathe for the first time, he whispered. Like the universe finally handed me a reason to keep moving. A Thraxian woman, the same who had shown support earlier, stepped forward and embraced him. You reminded us, she said, that fighting for what's right still matters. The next few hours blurred into a procession of forms, signatures, scheduled medical scans, safety evaluations. Administrative workers who had been distant before now offered genuine smiles. Even quiet congratulations. That evening, back in his modest habitation unit, Rylan released the younglings. They immediately bounded around the room before climbing into his lap. Leary nestled into the crook of his arm, her tiny resonance hum vibrating against his chest. Bryn pressed his head under Rylan's hand, demanding attention with soft, persistent chirps. You're safe now, Rylan whispered, voice thick. You're home. I've got you, always. Leary lifted her bright, impossible turquoise eyes and gently touched his cheek with her small paw. The gesture was deliberate, loving, healing. Something inside him, something he thought scorched forever, opened anew. Bryn nudged his hand, issuing a chirp of impatience that made Rylan laugh. Truly laugh. The sound startled even him. The cubs perked up immediately, delighted by it. A soft knock broke the moment. Rylan opened the door. Nira stood there alone, no cameras, no crew, no lights. I wanted to check on you, she said quietly. Privately. Just to make sure you're really all right. I am, Rylan replied, a small smile forming. For the first time since the wildfire season that shattered his life, he felt a fragile but undeniable sense of peace. Nira smiled at him, her reptilian features softened by genuine warmth, the light catching the iridescent scales along her jaw. What you did today reached far beyond those two little ones, she said. You pushed back against a system that desperately needed someone brave enough to challenge it. I just wanted to save them, he replied quietly. That's exactly why it mattered, Nira murmured. She hesitated, then added with a tone so casually placed it was clearly intentional. Nira asks about you, you know. In her interviews, and outside of them. Rylan blinked in surprise. Nira smiled knowingly. I'm just saying, you're not as alone as you think. You've built something here. A family, a community, a purpose. Don't shut yourself away from that. Before he could respond, Leary stirred. Her eyes fluttered open and spotting Rylan, she stretched luxuriously before trotting over and climbing into his lap with sleepy confidence. Bryn followed, pressing against Rylan's side, his deep green eyes reflecting soft starlight. See? Nira whispered. You're already home. And Rylan, stroking Leary's soft fur while Bryn purred into his leg, realized she was right. Somewhere between discovering two terrified younglings in the ruins and this quiet moment beneath a shimmering tree, he had rebuilt something he believed the fires had stolen forever. Not a substitute for the life he'd lost. Nothing could ever replace his wife, his daughter, the world that burned away, but something new. Something precious on its own terms. Home wasn't the building. It was the small lives trusting him to guide them. The neighbors willing to stand beside him. The calm earned through hardship. For the first time since the catastrophe, Rylan Voss felt like he belonged, but the universe wasn't finished teaching him. Harder truths still waited. Truths about identity, about love, about the responsibility of protecting those who could not yet protect themselves. 6 months after he gained custody, the review committee prepared for its final vote on sweeping hybrid reforms. Rylan's testimony, raw, emotional, firsthand, had become their cornerstone. Politicians and scholars relied on his lived experience to fill the gaps their theories couldn't. The preliminary proposals signaled a revolution. Hybrid registration instead of termination protocols, full sentient rights irrespective of genetic design, integrated education systems, anti-discrimination laws, community support programs. Predictably, resistance existed, but change had momentum. Nira's documentaries ignited debates across star systems. Other governments re-examined their own policies, and Nira herself became a more familiar presence in Rylan's life. Her visits stretched longer, no longer just for recording. She brought little gifts for Leary and Bryn, helped prepare meals, joined bedtime routines, and stayed afterward to talk beneath the courtyard tree. One evening after the siblings had fallen asleep, Rylan and Nira sat beneath the metal leaf canopy while Kethar, Prime's twin moons, traced slow arcs across the night. They're voting next week, Nira murmured. This could change everything. Your testimony. They need you. I'm only one voice, Rylan said quietly. You're the voice that pushed this all into motion, she countered. The man who stood before the council and made them see hybrids not as errors or threats, but as children with futures. She paused, expression wavering into something unguarded. You've changed more than policies. Rylan, you've changed how people imagine family. He glanced toward the glow of the window where Leary and Bryn slept. I had good reasons, he said softly. Still do. Nira inhaled slowly, scales reflecting a radiant wash of moonlight. Her crest shimmered in hues of deep blue, giving her an ethereal beauty he couldn't ignore. Rylan, she said gently, I know your heart is still mending. Your world was torn apart, and your focus now is on giving those two the life they deserve. But I want you to know, when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'm here. Not as a reporter, not just a friend. I'm here as someone who sees what you've built, and wants to. Rylan's breath stalled in his chest. He had never let himself imagine companionship. Beyond duty, never dared believe his heart had room for anything except the younglings he was raising, and the memories he carried like old burns. But looking at Nira now, the quiet warmth in her eyes, he realized something profound. Hearts didn't stay shattered forever. They learned to hold loss and hope at the same time. I'm not ready, he admitted softly. Not yet, but I think I will be. And when that day comes, yes, I'd want that too. Nira's lips curved into a smile, her azure scales catching the moonlight, like shards of starlight drifting across her skin. Then I'll wait, she whispered. 7 days later, the Reform Committee cast its historic vote. Rylan stood before them with a confidence forged from grief. Courage and love earned the hard way. We fear what we don't understand, he said, voice steady. We invent labels to keep the universe tidy. But consciousness doesn't bow to our labels. Sentience doesn't need our permission to exist. These hybrid children think, feel, and love. The question isn't whether they deserve rights. The question is whether we deserve to call ourselves civilized. The committee voted 7-2 in favor. 3 weeks later, the full council ratified the new statutes, making Cathar Prime the first world in the coalition to grant hybrids full legal personhood. Other systems reacted with everything from applause to suspicion, but precedent now existed, and precedents grow. On the day the reforms became official law, Rylan brought Leary and Bryn back to the ruins where he had first found them. Small, starving, trembling creatures hiding in the shadows of war's aftermath. They were larger now, stronger, confident, but they remembered. "This is where our story began," Rylan said quietly. "Where everything changed." The wind sighed through the broken architecture as the younglings pressed close. "I want you to remember this place," he continued. "Not because it hurt you, but because you survived it. Because when the universe gave you every reason to give up, you kept going. You trusted someone you didn't know. That trust saved all of us," Leary chirped, her vocalizations now edging toward structured speech. Bryn leaned against Rylan's leg, a deep rumbling purr vibrating through the hollowed chamber. "You'll face challenges," Rylan said. "People who don't understand you. Systems still learning to include you. But you'll also find allies, friends, and you'll always have each other." He knelt. They pressed their foreheads against his. "I love you more than I believed my heart could ever love again," he whispered. "I thought I saved you that day. But you saved me too." That night, the district gathered for a modest celebration marking both the reforms and the small family who had become the heart of the movement. Food stalls lined the courtyard. Music echoed off the walls. Children of every species dashed about, playing without fear or boundaries. As the suns dipped below the skyline, Nira found Rylan standing at the edge of the celebration, watching Leary and Bryn tumble through the grass with Finn and the neighbor kids. "They look happy," she murmured. "They are," Rylan replied, "despite everything behind them. Despite everything ahead. That's because they have you," she said, stepping closer until her shoulder brushed. Is a gentle question he didn't shy away from. "What happens next?" she asked. "We keep growing," Rylan said. "Leary and Bryn grow older. The laws go into effect. More families come forward. We figure out what true integration looks like. And us?" Her voice barely carried above the laughter of children. Rylan turned to her, really seeing her. Not the journalist. Not the advocate. The woman who had stood beside him when the universe felt unbearably heavy. The woman who had believed in him long before he believed in himself. "Us," he said softly, "happens slowly, carefully, honestly, but yes, us happens." Nira's smile gleamed like a new star rising. Her fingers brushed his, warm scales against weathered human skin, and Rylan didn't pull away. Across the courtyard, Leary pounced on Bryn with playful ferocity. He rolled with her, pretending defeat, the two tumbling across the grass in a whirl of silver fur and emerald eyes. Finn shrieked with laughter and joined the chase. Above them, the binary sunset painted the district in impossible colors. Rose bleeding into gold, violet melting into ember-bright light, shades that shouldn't coexist yet somehow formed a perfect whole. Rylan Voss had come to Cathar Prime broken, displaced, convinced his capacity for love had been burned away with the family he lost. He had been wrong. Love was stubborn, tenacious, capable of growing through the smallest fractures, finding its way into the spaces grief left behind. He had saved 2 young lives pulled from the ruins of a forgotten war. But they had saved him too. They gave him purpose when he had nothing left. Gave him a family when he believed the chapter was closed forever. The future remained uncertain. The reforms would be challenged. Leary and Bryn would face prejudice. But here, in this courtyard under these moons, Rylan had built something real. Something that mattered. A home. A family. A quiet, determined declaration that compassion is stronger than convenience, and love is more powerful than law. As the stars emerged, scattered like promises across the endless night, Rylan held Nira's hand, watched his younglings play, and let himself feel something he once believed impossible. He allowed himself to believe in tomorrow. In a universe obsessed with boundaries, sometimes the most radical act is choosing to care, to see individuals instead of classifications, to build families out of fragments, to let light return to the places where darkness once ruled without question. Thank you for experiencing this story. If it touched you, consider sharing your thoughts below. Where in the galaxy are you watching from? Which moment in Ryland's journey stayed with you? Until next time, remember, sometimes the smallest lives carry the greatest truths.